He was born with blood-soaked fingers, or so legend claimed. A boy from a minor clan on the dusty steppe of Transoxiana, lame in one leg, armed with nothing but ambition. By the time he died, he ruled an empire stretching from the gates of Moscow to the plains of India, from the Mediterranean coast to the deserts of Mongolia. Kings trembled at his name. Cities turned to ash if they dared resist. He called himself the Sword of Islam, yet he butchered Muslims by the hundreds of thousands. He claimed descent from Genghis Khan, yet he was never a Khan himself. Historians call him Timur. The West remembers him as Tamerlane, Timur the Lame. But who was the real man behind the myth? Was he a liberator, a destroyer, a builder of civilization, or history's most efficient executioner? Today, we uncover the untold story of the man who reshaped Asia in fire and marble. In the year 1336, in a small village near the city of Shahrasabz in what is now Uzbekistan, a boy was born into the Barlas tribe, a Turkicized Mongol clan that had settled in Transoxiana generations earlier after the conquest of Genghis Khan. His name was Timur, and his family, though noble by local standards, held no great power. Transoxiana at the time was a fractured, lawless region, nominally part of the crumbling Chagatai Khanate, one of the four successor states to the Mongol Empire. Local warlords fought constantly for scraps of authority, and the old Mongol aristocratic order, built on bloodline descent from Genghis Khan, had decayed into a patchwork of petty rivalries. Timur's father, Taragai, was a minor landowner, pious and relatively unambitious. But the young Timur showed none of his father's restraint. From his earliest years, he displayed a hunger for power that set him apart. According to later court chroniclers, many of whom wrote under his direct patronage and therefore must be read with caution, Timur was a natural horseman, a skilled archer, and a shrewd reader of people, able to forge alliances and break them with equal ease. It was during his youth, likely in his 20s, that Timur sustained the injuries that would define his physical legacy and his Western name. Accounts vary. Persian chronicles suggest he was wounded while raiding livestock as a young warlord, an arrow striking his leg and another injury damaging his right hand. Soviet-era archaeological investigation of his tomb in the 20th century, conducted by Mikhail Gerasimov, confirmed that Timur did indeed suffer from a fused right knee and a withered right arm, lending credibility to the idea of serious early injury, though the exact circumstances remain debated among historians. From these wounds came his epithet, Timur-Lang, Timur the Lame, which European writers later corrupted into Tamerlane. Disabled but undeterred, Timur built his power through the classic steppe method, forging a band of loyal followers, raiding rivals, and shifting alliances whenever convenient. In the 1360s, Transoxiana was contested by competing factions, and Timur allied himself with a rising chieftain named Emir Hussein. Together, they fought against various rivals, including incursions by the Chagatai Khans and rival Mongol-descended clans. The partnership between Timur and Hussein was a marriage of convenience rather than loyalty. Both men understood that one of them would eventually have to eliminate the other to claim sole power over Transoxiana. By the late 1360s, after years of shifting battles, betrayals, and reconciliations, Timur outmaneuvered Hussein entirely. In 1370, after a decisive campaign, Hussein was captured and executed, and Timur emerged as the unchallenged master of Transoxiana. He made the ancient city of Samarkand his capital, a city that would later become the jewel of his empire, rebuilt with the finest architects, artisans, and treasures plundered from across Asia. Crucially, Timur never claimed the title of Khan. Mongol political tradition, even in its decayed state, required that the supreme ruler trace direct descent from Genghis Khan himself. Timur could claim no such lineage. Instead, he adopted the title Emir, meaning commander or prince, and ruled in the name of puppet Khans descended from Chagatai, Genghis Khan's son. This was a masterstroke of political legitimacy. Timur held all real power while technically respecting Mongol custom, governing through figurehead Khans who provided ceremonial cover for his absolute authority. He further cemented his position through marriage, taking a wife who was a descendant of Genghis Khan, which allowed him to adopt the prestigious title Gurjin, son-in-law of the Khan, a title that gave him symbolic legitimacy without requiring the bloodline he lacked. With Transoxiana secured, Timur turned his ambitions outward. He understood that the fractured political landscape of Central Asia, Persia, and the Middle East was ripe for conquest. The old order, built by Genghis Khan a century and a half earlier, had splintered into rival khanates, sultanates, and emirates, each too weak to resist a unified, disciplined force. Timur intended to be that force. He began organizing his military along lines reminiscent of the Mongol war machine: decimal organization of troops, heavy reliance on cavalry, sophisticated siege techniques learned from Persian and Chinese engineers, and an almost obsessive emphasis on logistics and intelligence gathering before any campaign. By the mid-1370s, Timur had begun a series of campaigns in a neighboring Khwarezm and the eastern Chagatai territories, defeating local rulers and absorbing their lands and armies into his growing war machine. These early campaigns were brutal testing grounds, where Timur refined the tactics and administrative systems that would later allow him to govern and terrorize an empire spanning thousands of miles. He demanded absolute loyalty from conquered territories, and any resistance was met with overwhelming, calculated violence designed not just to defeat enemies, but to deter future rebellion through sheer terror. By 1380, Timur stood at the edge of a new phase in his career. No longer a regional warlord consolidating Transoxiana, but an emperor-in-waiting preparing to project power across Persia, the Caucasus, and ultimately into the heartlands of the Islamic world and beyond. With Transoxiana firmly under his control, Timur launched what historians now call his three-year campaign, beginning around 1386, targeting Persia and the Caucasus. This was the first true demonstration of the scale of devastation Timur was willing to inflict to secure submission. Persia at the time was fragmented among various local dynasties, including the Muzaffarids in the south and the Jalurids in the west, none capable of mounting unified resistance against a disciplined invading force. City after city fell to Timur's armies. Isfahan, one of Persia's greatest cities, initially surrendered peacefully and was spared. But when its citizens rose up and killed the Timurid tax collectors left to govern them, Timur's response became one of the most infamous episodes of his entire career. He ordered a complete massacre of the population. Chroniclers, including those sympathetic to Timur, recorded that pyramids of severed heads were constructed outside the city walls, with estimates of the dead ranging from 70,000 to over 200,000 depending on the source. Numbers that modern historians treat with appropriate skepticism given the tendency of medieval chronicles toward exaggeration, but which nonetheless point to a massacre of staggering scale. This pattern, initial offer of mercy upon surrender, followed by annihilation upon any sign of rebellion, became Timur's signature method of psychological warfare, ensuring that future cities understood the stakes of resistance. Timur's campaigns were never simply destructive, however. Alongside the brutality ran a sophisticated policy of cultural extraction. Wherever his armies conquered, Timur ordered the relocation of skilled artisans, architects, scholars, and craftsmen back to Samarkand. This was deliberate empire building. Timur intended to make his capital the most magnificent city in the Islamic world, and he achieved this not through indigenous development, but through the forced transplantation of talent from every land he conquered. Persian tilework, Indian masons, Syrian glassworkers, and Chinese artisans all eventually contributed to the architectural splendor of Samarkand under Timur's patronage. In the late 1380s and into the 1390s, Timur turned his attention northward and westward, engaging in a protracted and historically significant conflict with Toktamish, Khan of the Golden Horde, the Mongol successor state ruling over the Russian principalities and the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Toktamish had once been an ally and even a protege of Timur, having received Timur's support in his own rise to power within the Golden Horde. But once secure in his throne, Toktamish turned against his former patron, raiding Timurid territories in Transoxiana and asserting independent ambitions. This betrayal triggered a series of major campaigns, culminating in two decisive battles: the Battle of the Kondurcha River in 1391 and the Battle of the Terek River in 1395. In both engagements, Timur's superior tactical organization and battle-hardened forces shattered Toktamish's armies. The 1395 campaign was particularly devastating for the Golden Horde. Timur's forces pursued the remnants of Toktamish's power deep into Russian territory, sacking key cities including Astrakhan and possibly raiding as far as the outskirts of Moscow's sphere of influence, though Moscow itself was likely spared direct assault. This campaign critically weakened the Golden Horde's capacity to dominate the Russian principalities, indirectly accelerating the long-term decline of Mongol Tatar power over Russia and setting conditions that some historians argue contributed to Moscow's eventual rise to regional dominance in subsequent centuries. Simultaneously, Timur consolidated control over the Caucasus, subjugating Georgia in a series of brutal campaigns that saw the destruction of churches and monasteries alongside the typical pattern of massacre and submission. Georgian chronicles record repeated invasions throughout the 1390s, as the kingdom repeatedly rebelled and was repeatedly crushed, reflecting both Georgian resilience and the relentless nature of Timurid military pressure. By the mid-1390s, Timur's empire stretched from the borders of India to the Caucasus, from Transoxiana through the entirety of Persia. Yet rather than consolidating and resting, Timur began preparations for what would become one of the most notorious campaigns of his career, an invasion of the Delhi Sultanate, the wealthy and powerful Islamic kingdom ruling much of northern India. In 1398, Timur crossed the Indus River and began his invasion of the Delhi Sultanate, then ruled by the Tughlaq dynasty under Sultan Nasir Mahmud, a weak ruler presiding over a kingdom riven by internal strife. Timur justified the invasion publicly on religious grounds, claiming the Delhi Sultanate's rulers were insufficiently strict in their treatment of Hindu subjects and had grown lax in upholding Islamic law. Though most historians view this justification as a thin pretext for what was fundamentally a campaign of plunder. Delhi was renowned across the Islamic world as one of the wealthiest cities in existence, and Timur's empire, despite its territorial extent, continually required fresh infusions of treasure to fund its military machine and Timur's ambitious architectural projects in Samarkand. The invasion proceeded with characteristic speed and brutality. Timurid forces defeated regional resistance throughout the Punjab before advancing on Delhi itself. Before the decisive battle outside the city in December 1398, Timur ordered the execution of approximately 100,000 captured prisoners, a controversial and heavily debated episode in his career. The most commonly cited justification, recorded in Timur's own purported memoirs, the authenticity of which remains disputed among historians, was that he feared the captives might revolt or aid the city's defenders during the impending battle, and he viewed their mass execution as a military necessity rather than gratuitous cruelty. Whatever the precise motivation, the scale of the killing remains one of the darkest episodes of the entire Timurid conquest record. The subsequent battle and capture of Delhi proved devastating for the city. Despite initial promises of clemency in exchange for tribute, the situation spiraled into chaos as Timurid soldiers, by most accounts acting partly outside direct command and partly with implicit sanction, engaged in days of pillage, slaughter, and arson. Estimates of the dead vary enormously across chronicles, ranging from tens of thousands to figures exceeding 100,000. And as with other Timurid atrocities, modern historians treat the most extreme numbers with considerable caution, while acknowledging that the destruction was severe and historically significant. Delhi's economy and population took decades to recover from the sack. Timur did not stay to govern India directly. True to his pattern across his entire career, he was a conqueror and extractor of wealth rather than a long-term administrator of distant territories. After looting the city's treasury, including legendary quantities of gold, jewels, and captured war elephants, which Timur incorporated into his own military as a novel addition to his army, he withdrew back towards Central Asia by early 1399, leaving the Delhi Sultanate fundamentally weakened and setting the stage for its eventual fragmentation and the rise of new regional powers in northern India in the subsequent decades. Timur's final great campaign began in 1399 and turned westward toward the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and Syria and the rising Ottoman Empire under Sultan Bayezid I. This campaign would produce one of the most consequential confrontations of the medieval world. Timur first moved against the Mamluks, capturing the great cities of Aleppo and Damascus in 1400 and 1401. The sack of Damascus was particularly significant culturally, as Timur ordered the relocation of the city's renowned scholars and craftsmen to Samarkand, including, according to many accounts, the great historian Ibn Khaldun, who reportedly met with Timur personally during the siege. An encounter that produced one of the most remarkable first-hand accounts of Timur's character and intellect from a contemporary Arab scholar. With Syria subdued, Timur turned his full attention to the Ottoman Empire, whose Sultan Bayezid I had been steadily expanding Ottoman power across Anatolia and into the Balkans, even laying siege to Constantinople itself. The rivalry between Timur and Bayezid had been building for years, fueled by territorial disputes in eastern Anatolia and by mutual contempt. Both men were proud, ambitious, and unwilling to accept the other as an equal. The confrontation came to a head at the Battle of Ankara in July 1402, one of the largest and most consequential battles of the entire medieval period. The Battle of Ankara, fought on the 28th of July, 1402, pitted two of the most powerful military forces in the Islamic world against each other. Bayezid I commanded a formidable Ottoman army that included Janissary infantry, Serbian heavy cavalry allies, and various vassal forces drawn from across the Ottoman domains in the Balkans and Anatolia. Timur commanded a vast multinational force drawn from across his empire, including his elite Central Asian cavalry, Persian and Caucasian auxiliaries, and crucially, the captured war elephants from his Indian campaign. The battle turned decisively against Bayezid when several of his Anatolian vassal forces, who held grievances against Ottoman centralization policies, defected to Timur's side mid-battle. This betrayal shattered Ottoman cohesion, and despite fierce resistance from the Janissaries and Bayezid's personal bodyguard, the Ottoman army collapsed. Bayezid himself was captured, an almost unthinkable humiliation for the ruler of what had seemed an unstoppable rising empire. Accounts of Bayezid's subsequent treatment vary considerably. Later European legend, fueled by anti-Timurid propaganda and dramatic embellishment, claimed Bayezid was kept in a cage and used as a footstool. But most modern historians consider these specific details likely exaggerated or invented, while acknowledging that Bayezid was indeed held in captivity under guard until his death in 1403, whether by illness or by his own hand, according to some accounts. The defeat at Ankara plunged the Ottoman Empire into more than a decade of civil war among Bayezid's sons, a period known as the Ottoman Interregnum, which significantly delayed Ottoman expansion into the Balkans and arguably extended the lifespan of the Byzantine Empire by several decades. Since the Ottomans had been on the verge of capturing Constantinople before Timur's intervention forced them to refocus inward. In this sense, Timur's eastern campaign had unintended but historically significant consequences for the fate of Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. Having crushed both the Mamluks and the Ottomans, Timur stood as the unrivaled dominant power across the Islamic world by 1404. Yet rather than resting on these achievements, the aging conqueror, now approaching 70 years old, began planning his most ambitious campaign yet, an invasion of Ming China, ostensibly justified by diplomatic disputes over tribute and protocol with the newly established Ming dynasty. Timur had spent his final months mustering an enormous army for this eastern campaign, a testament to his restless ambition even in old age. He never lived to begin it. In January 1405, while leading his army eastward through the bitter winter cold near Otrar, in what is now southern Kazakhstan, Timur fell ill, likely from a combination of age, exhaustion, and possibly a fever or related illness, and died on the 19th of February, 1405. His death immediately threw his vast empire into succession crises, as his sons and grandsons fought for control of the Timurid territories, a struggle that would not be resolved until his son Shah Rukh and later his grandson Ulugh established more stable, though significantly reduced, successor states. Timur's body was embalmed and transported back to Samarkand, where he was interred in the magnificent mausoleum known as the Guri-Emir, a structure of breathtaking blue-tiled domes and intricate tilework that remains one of the great masterpieces of Timurid architecture and a direct testament to the cultural legacy he built alongside his record of conquest. In 1941, Soviet archaeologist Mikhail Gerasimov opened Timur's tomb as part of a scientific expedition, confirming through skeletal examination the historical accounts of his lameness and withered arm. A local legend, almost certainly apocryphal but widely repeated, claims an inscription warned that disturbing the tomb would unleash a terrible war, and that the opening of the tomb occurred mere days before Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union in June 1941, a coincidence that has fueled enduring folklore despite having no historical or causal basis. Timur's legacy remains deeply contested. To the peoples of Persia, the Caucasus, India, and the Levant, he is remembered as a uniquely devastating conqueror whose campaigns left demographic and cultural scars lasting generations, with some regions taking over a century to recover their pre-invasion populations and economic vitality. Yet to Uzbekistan and much of Central Asia today, Timur is celebrated as a national hero and founding figure, his statues replacing those of Lenin across Tashkent and Samarkand after the collapse of the Soviet Union. His image used to construct a narrative of Central Asian greatness and civilizational achievement. The Timurid Renaissance he set in motion, flourishing under his descendants, particularly the astronomer King Ulugh, and culminating culturally in the Mongol Empire founded by his descendant Babur in India, produced some of the most extraordinary architectural, scientific, and artistic achievements of the late medieval and early modern Islamic world. An enduring irony, given that this cultural flowering was financed and enabled by some of the most violent campaigns of conquest in recorded history.